They mocked at the black woman for being single at 40, until the most desired cowboy fell in love with her soul, reaching across the crowded barn dance floor while every tongue in town fell silent. The seamstress sits alone in her window above Main Street, enduring daily whispers about spinster shame and wasted years. The railroad town sees her quiet dignity as defeat, her gentle hands as proof of a woman past her time. Her fate seems sealed, loneliness until death. Yet the golden-haired rancher, heir to the territory's largest cattle empire, has watched her secret kindnesses for months. When a mysterious inheritance threatens to change everything, both face an impossible choice between duty and desire. A family legacy hangs in the balance, a fortune waits to be claimed, and cruel tongues sharpen for the scandal brewing. Will they risk everything society expects of them for a love that defies every rule? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The needle pierced through calico fabric as Josephine Gaines stitched by her window above Main Street. At 40 years old, she had grown accustomed to the whispers that drifted up from the dusty road below. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, each stitch a small act of defiance against a world that had deemed her invisible. The door chime at Henderson's General Store rang across the street. Josephine glanced up to see Dolores Carter emerge with her usual collection of followers. Their voices carried on the desert wind. Poor Josephine, 40 years old and never been courted. Some women just aren't meant for marriage, I suppose. What a pity. All those years wasted. Josephine's hands stilled for just a moment. She had heard worse, but the casual cruelty still stung. She resumed her stitching, keeping her face composed as the women continued their daily ritual of dissecting the lives of others. This was Copper Ridge in 1882, a booming railroad town where cattle ranchers and railroad money created invisible but rigid social hierarchies. Everyone knew their place. Josephine's place, according to the townspeople, was at the margins. She finished the hem on Mrs. Patterson's dress and set it aside. Tomorrow she would deliver it and collect her modest payment. The routine had sustained her for 15 years since she had arrived in Copper Ridge with nothing but her sewing skills and fierce determination to survive. The thunder of hooves announced the arrival of the Reed men. Through her window, Josephine watched Colton Reed dismount from his bay stallion with fluid grace. At 35, he commanded attention wherever he went. Golden hair caught the afternoon sun as he tipped his hat to the ladies outside Henderson's store. The town's most eligible bachelor. Every family with an unmarried daughter had set their sights on him. He was handsome, wealthy, and heir to the Reed Cattle Company that employed half of Copper Ridge. Dolores Carter immediately positioned herself in his path. The other women preened and giggled as he acknowledged them with polite nods. Josephine had observed this same scene countless times. She understood her role as invisible spectator. Colton disappeared into the bank while his father, Judson Reed, conducted business at the livestock office. The Reed empire cast a long shadow over the territory. Their success or failure affected everyone in town. A commotion outside drew Josephine's attention back to the street. A stranger in a fine suit stepped down from the afternoon stage. He carried a leather satchel and surveyed the town with the measured gaze of a man on important business. The stranger approached several people on the street, apparently asking questions. Josephine returned to her work, but kept one eye on the unfolding scene below. 20 minutes later, the stranger knocked on her door. Josephine descended the narrow stairs and opened the door to find a middle-aged man with kind eyes and official bearing. "Miss Josephine Gaines?" "Yes." "I am Thomas Whitfield, attorney at law from San Francisco. I have been searching for you regarding the estate of your late aunt, Cordelia Gaines." Josephine's breath caught. She had not heard from Aunt Cordelia in over 2 decades. The woman who had raised her after her parents died had vanished from her life when Josephine was 20. "Please, come in." Mr. Whitfield climbed the stairs to her modest living quarters above the shop. He opened his satchel and withdrew an envelope bearing an official seal. "Your aunt passed away 3 months ago. She has left you her entire estate." The words seemed to float in the air between them. Josephine sank into her chair, struggling to comprehend their meaning. "I'm afraid I don't understand. My aunt and I lost contact years ago." "She never lost track of you, Miss Gaines. She has been quite successful in San Francisco. Her dressmaking business serves the city's most prominent families. She also owned a Victorian mansion in Nob Hill." Mr. Whitfield placed documents on her small table. The numbers on the papers seemed impossible. "The estate is valued at over $50,000. However, there is one condition. You must travel to San Francisco within 30 days to claim the inheritance. If you do not appear by the deadline, the estate will be donated to charity." Josephine stared at the papers. $50,000. The sum represented more wealth than most people in Copper Ridge would see in 10 lifetimes. "I need time to consider this." "Of course. I will be staying at the hotel tonight and departing on tomorrow's stage. If you decide to accept, I can arrange your travel to San Francisco." After Mr. Whitfield left, Josephine sat in stunned silence. The inheritance offered escape from a town that had never fully accepted her, but it also meant leaving the only home she had known for 15 years. Word traveled fast in Copper Ridge. By evening, everyone knew about Josephine's windfall. The same women who had mocked her that morning now appeared at her door with warm smiles and offers of friendship. Dolores Carter arrived with a basket of baked goods and sudden interest in deepening their acquaintance. The transformation was as swift as it was transparent. "Dear Josephine, I always knew you were destined for greater things." The hypocrisy nauseated her more than their earlier cruelty had wounded her. At least their previous scorn had been honest. This false kindness felt like a different kind of prison. As night fell over Copper Ridge, Josephine faced an impossible choice: accept the inheritance and flee to an uncertain future in San Francisco, or remain in a town where she would now be valued only for her newfound wealth. Either path led away from the authentic acceptance she had always craved. The monthly barn dance arrived with unusual anticipation. News of Josephine's inheritance had transformed her from town pariah to reluctant celebrity overnight. Women who had crossed streets to avoid her now competed for her attention. Josephine selected her finest dress, a deep blue creation she had sewn for herself but never worn. The fabric fell in elegant lines that complemented her graceful figure. She had crafted it during lonely evenings, never imagining an occasion worthy of wearing it. The barn blazed with lantern light as couples whirled across the hay-strewn floor. Josephine entered alone, her chin held high despite the weight of dozens of stares. Conversations paused as she passed. The same faces that had regarded her with pity now watched with calculating interest. Dolores Carter descended like a hawk spotting prey, her smile stretched wide and artificial. "Josephine, darling, you simply must sit with us. We've saved you a place of honor." The circle of women who had mocked her yesterday now welcomed her with suffocating enthusiasm. They peppered her with questions about San Francisco and offered unsolicited advice about managing her fortune. Their transparent motives disgusted her more than their previous cruelty ever had. Margaret Whitmore held court across the barn, surrounded by admirers. The railroad heiress had arrived from Denver that morning with her father and an entourage of servants. Her ivory silk gown probably cost more than most families earned in a year. She represented everything Copper Ridge society valued: youth, beauty, and inherited wealth. The musicians struck up a waltz. Eager young men lined up to request dances with Margaret while matrons positioned their daughters strategically around the room. The social machinery of the town operated with practiced precision. Josephine remained seated among her newfound false friends, observing the elaborate courtship rituals. She had attended these dances for years as an invisible spectator. Tonight, wealth had purchased her a seat at the table, but she felt more isolated than ever. Colton Reed entered with his father. The younger Reed wore his formal black suit with natural elegance. His golden hair caught the lantern light as he surveyed the crowded barn. Every unmarried woman in the room tracked his movement with predatory focus. Judson Reed steered his son directly toward Margaret Whitmore. The railroad heiress brightened at their approach, her fan fluttering with practiced coquetry. Her father stepped forward to facilitate the introduction with obvious pleasure. The dance floor cleared as Colton led Margaret through an elegant waltz. They moved together with mechanical precision, a perfect display of social expectations fulfilled. The watching crowd murmured approval at the suitable pairing. Josephine prepared to leave. The evening had proven what she already knew. Wealth might change how others treated her, but it could not manufacture genuine connection. She had purchased their attention with $50,000 of inheritance money. She rose from her chair as the waltz ended. Colton escorted Margaret back to her father before turning toward the refreshment table. His path took him directly past Josephine's location. Their eyes met across the crowded barn. For a moment, the noise and motion around them seemed to fade. Colton changed direction and approached her group. Dolores Carter practically vibrated with excitement at the prospect of witnessing social drama unfold. "Miss Gaines." Colton's voice carried quiet confidence that cut through the surrounding chatter. Josephine felt her pulse quicken despite her efforts to remain composed. "Mr. Reed, would you honor me with the next dance?" The barn fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every eye focused on the impossible scene unfolding before them. The town's most eligible bachelor had just asked the formerly scorned seamstress to dance. Josephine hesitated. She understood the significance of this moment. Accepting would mark her as either brave or foolish. Declining would confirm her place as an outsider despite her newfound wealth. "Yes." Colton offered his arm and led her onto the dance floor. The watching crowd parted like water around them. Josephine felt the weight of their stares but focused on the steady strength of her partner's presence. The musicians began a gentle waltz. Colton's hand settled at her waist with respectful firmness. They moved together with surprising harmony, as if they had danced together countless times before. "I noticed you helping the Morrison children when they were ill last month." His words caught her off guard. She had not realized anyone had observed her visits to the struggling family. "Mrs. Morrison needed assistance with the sewing to keep food on their table." "You also repaired the church vestments without payment." Heat rose in Josephine's cheeks. She had not sought recognition for those small acts of service. The church has little money for such expenses. "You teach Sunday school to the children whose parents work Sundays." The dance continued around them while Colton cataloged kindnesses she had assumed went unnoticed. His observations revealed months of careful attention to her character rather than her circumstances. "You see much for someone who has everything handed to him." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps that's exactly why I see it." The waltz ended too soon. Colton escorted her from the dance floor with the same courtesy he had shown Margaret Whitmore. But something in his manner suggested this interaction carried deeper meaning than social obligation. "I would like to call on you tomorrow afternoon, if you would permit it." The request sent whispers rippling through the watching crowd. Josephine felt the moment's significance settling around them like dust after a storm. "I would welcome that." Colton tipped his hat and returned to his social obligations. Josephine made her way toward the barn entrance, acutely aware of the stares and whispered speculation following her departure. For the first time in her 40 years, someone had seen her truly. Not the inheritance money or the whispered reputation, but the woman who chose kindness when no one was watching. Colton arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a bouquet of desert wildflowers. Josephine had spent the morning questioning the wisdom of allowing his visit. The entire town would scrutinize every detail of their interaction. She descended to answer his knock, smoothing her simple green dress. The flowers he offered were humble compared to the elaborate arrangements wealthy suitors typically presented, but their wild beauty touched her more than expensive roses ever could. "These grow along the ridge behind our ranch. I thought you might appreciate their resilience." She invited him into her modest parlor above the shop. He accepted her offer of coffee and settled into the chair across from her small table. His presence filled the cramped space without overwhelming it. "Tell me about your dreams, Miss Gaines." The unexpected question caught her off guard. Most conversations in Copper Ridge focused on weather, gossip, or business. No one had ever asked about her private hopes. I have often wondered what it would be like to use my skills to help other women learn independence. Through sewing, a trade provides dignity. It offers a path forward when circumstances become difficult. Colton nodded with understanding that surprised her. She had expected polite dismissal of such practical concerns from a man who had never known want. My mother died when I was 12. I watched her struggle in her final months because she had no means of supporting herself independently. She had been raised to rely entirely on others for her security. His confession revealed vulnerability beneath his confident exterior. Josephine recognized the pain of loss that never fully healed. "Where did you learn your craft?" "My grandmother taught me." She was born into slavery, but purchased her family's freedom with money earned from her needlework. Josephine had never shared this history with anyone in Copper Ridge. The story felt too precious for casual conversation, but something in Colton's manner invited honesty. Each stitch she taught me carried the weight of her sacrifice. She would say that skillful hands could never be enslaved because they create value wherever they go. Colton listened with focused attention that made her feel heard rather than merely tolerated. His interest appeared genuine rather than the calculated charm she had observed him display at social gatherings. "You honor her legacy through your work. I try to remember her strength when the world feels unkind." They talked through the afternoon as shadows lengthened across her parlor floor. Colton shared his own struggles with expectations that felt like chains disguised as privilege. Everyone assumes wealth eliminates problems, but it often creates different varieties of prison. "What confines you?" "The assumption that I must marry for advantage rather than affection, that my personal happiness matters less than business connections and social advancement." The confession hung between them with startling intimacy. Josephine understood the courage required to voice such private doubts. 3 days later, Colton appeared at the church social, despite the gossip his presence would generate. He sought her out immediately, ignoring the calculating glances from other families. Dolores Carter approached with venomous sweetness, masquerading as concern. "Colton, dear boy, surely you realize the unfortunate impression your attention to certain individuals might create." The insult struck like a physical blow. Josephine felt her composure wavering under the weight of public humiliation. Colton's expression hardened. "I realize that some individuals mistake cruelty for sophistication, Mrs. Carter. I find such confusion deeply unfortunate." His defense of her sent ripples through the watching crowd. No man of his social standing had ever challenged the town's unspoken hierarchies so directly. Later, they walked along the ridge behind the Reed Ranch as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The isolation allowed them to speak freely without performing for audience of gossips. "Why do you see me differently than others do?" Colton stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Because I have been watching you for months. I have seen you share your lunch with hungry children when you thought no one noticed. I have witnessed you stay up all night sewing clothes for the widow whose husband died in the mine accident. You give without expectation of reward or recognition." His words unlocked something in her chest that had remained guarded for decades. "I was taught that character reveals itself through actions taken when no one is watching." "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She survived what should have destroyed her and built something beautiful from the pieces. I aspire to such resilience." They reached the spot where he had gathered the wildflowers. The vista stretched endlessly toward purple mountains that seemed to touch the sky. "I brought you here because this place represents freedom to me. No social expectations or business obligations exist in this wilderness." Josephine understood his meaning. Here, they could simply be themselves without the weight of public scrutiny or predetermined roles. Margaret Whitmore's arrival in town had intensified pressure on Colton to fulfill expectations. Judson Reed made no secret of his approval for the railroad heiress. Her wealth and connections offered everything a practical marriage should provide. But Colton continued his visits to Josephine's shop, bringing books of poetry and engaging in conversations that fed her intellect as much as her heart. He asked her opinions on matters typically reserved for male discussion, treating her thoughts with respect that felt revolutionary. The 25-day deadline for her inheritance loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. Soon she would need to choose between the security of wealth in San Francisco and the uncertain promise of love in Copper Ridge. The town watched their growing attachment with fascination and disapproval. Some whispered that the seamstress had used her inheritance to purchase affections that money could never truly buy. But in the quiet moments they shared away from prying eyes, Josephine began to believe that authentic love might actually exist beyond the pages of romantic novels she had read by candlelight during countless lonely evenings. Colton's invitation to meet his sister Eleanor came on a crisp October morning. The Reed family homestead sat 5 miles north of town, where Eleanor lived with her husband and 3 children. Josephine accepted, despite knowing this meeting would signal serious intentions to anyone observing their courtship. Eleanor Reed Morrison possessed her brother's golden hair and kind eyes, but her manner carried the practical warmth of a woman who had chosen love over social advantage. She greeted Josephine at the door with genuine pleasure rather than polite obligation. "Colton has spoken of you constantly for weeks. I was beginning to think he had invented the perfect woman." The farmhouse reflected comfortable prosperity without ostentation. Children's laughter echoed from the kitchen where Eleanor's youngest daughter helped prepare Sunday dinner. The atmosphere radiated the contentment Josephine had always imagined a true home should possess. "Your brother seems to believe I am more remarkable than evidence suggests." "He sees clearly when it matters. Colton may be charming, but he has never been easily impressed." They spent the afternoon sharing stories while Eleanor's children played nearby. The older woman's acceptance felt like a gift Josephine had not dared hope for. Here was someone who valued character over circumstances, substance over superficial advantages. As evening approached, Colton arrived to escort Josephine back to town. Eleanor embraced her warmly at parting. "You belong with us. I hope you realize that." The words lingered in Josephine's mind during the ride home. Belonging had always seemed impossible in Copper Ridge, but perhaps family could be chosen rather than simply endured. 2 days later, Colton suggested a picnic by Willow Creek. They rode out in his wagon carrying Eleanor's basket of food and a quilt for sitting. The creek wound through cottonwood groves that provided shelter from autumn wind. Josephine spread the quilt while Colton tended the horses. The isolation felt both intimate and dangerous. They had been alone together before, but never so far from the possibility of interruption. They shared Eleanor's fried chicken and fresh bread while discussing books they had read and places they hoped to visit. The conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of deep compatibility. "I must tell you something that frightens me." Colton's serious tone made her pulse quicken with apprehension. "I have been thinking of you constantly, not just your beauty, though you are lovely. Your wisdom draws me like nothing I have ever experienced." He reached across the quilt to take her hand. His touch sent warmth racing through her entire body. "I love you, Josephine Gaines. I love your strength and kindness, and the way you see good in others when they cannot see it in themselves." The declaration hung between them like something precious and fragile. Josephine felt tears threatening despite her efforts at composure. "I never believed anyone could love me as I truly am." "Then you have been surrounded by fools who could not recognize treasure when it stood before them." He leaned closer until she could see golden flecks in his brown eyes. The kiss that followed felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The creek murmured nearby as they held each other in the fading afternoon light. Josephine memorized every detail of the moment, knowing it would sustain her through whatever trials lay ahead. But the weight of practical concerns pressed against their happiness like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Margaret Whitmore had intensified her pursuit since the barn dance, appearing wherever Colton conducted business in town. Her father made increasingly pointed comments about beneficial partnerships between their families. Josephine's inheritance deadline loomed with only 18 days remaining. Mr. Whitfield had sent a telegram confirming that the San Francisco business required immediate attention to prevent financial losses. That evening, Josephine worked late in her shop, trying to distract herself from impossible decisions. The sound of horses outside drew her attention to the window. Judson Reed dismounted alone and approached her door. The older Reed's visit at such an hour could only mean trouble. Josephine descended to admit him, noting the tension in his weathered features. "Miss Gaines, I apologize for the late hour, but I must speak plainly about my son's future." She invited him inside, though dread settled in her stomach like lead weight. "Colton is young and romantic. He does not understand the practical realities facing our family." Judson's words carried the weight of desperation poorly concealed. Something in his manner suggested problems beyond simple disapproval of his son's choice. The Reed Ranch employs 37 men with families depending on steady wages. We face challenges that require careful alliances to survive. What sort of challenges? The kind that destroy legacies built over decades if handled poorly. He would not elaborate, but his meaning became clear. The Reed Empire faced serious financial difficulties that only advantageous marriage could solve. After Judson left, Josephine sat in her parlor wrestling with new understanding. Colton's choice between love and duty carried consequences affecting dozens of innocent families. Her happiness might cost others their livelihoods. She pulled out the legal documents from her aunt's estate, studying the complex business arrangements with fresh eyes. The inheritance included more than money and property. Cordelia Gaines had built connections throughout San Francisco's financial community. As dawn approached, an idea began forming in Josephine's mind. The solution would require courage and sacrifice, but it might offer a path forward that honored both love and responsibility. The question remained whether Colton could accept help from the woman he claimed to love, or if pride would destroy their chance at happiness together. Josephine spent 3 sleepless nights researching her aunt's business connections before she gathered the courage to investigate further. The inheritance documents included correspondence with San Francisco investors who specialized in agricultural ventures throughout the Western Territories. She visited the land office under pretense of reviewing her aunt's property holdings. The clerk, eager to assist the newly wealthy woman, provided access to recent transaction records. What she discovered made her stomach clench with dread. The Reed Ranch had quietly sold 3 prime grazing sections over the past 8 months. Each sale represented desperate attempts to service mounting debts. The remaining property barely supported current operations, and foreclosure notices had been filed but not yet served. Colton knew nothing of his family's financial ruin. Judson had hidden the crisis while pressuring his son toward marriage with Margaret Whitmore. The railroad heiress represented salvation, disguised as social advancement. Josephine understood the terrible mathematics of their situation. If Colton chose love over duty, 37 families would lose their livelihoods when the ranch collapsed. But if he sacrificed their happiness for practical necessity, both their hearts would break under the weight of what might have been. She found Colton at the creek where they had shared their first kiss. He was skipping stones across the water with the aimless energy of a man wrestling with impossible choices. "There is something you need to know about your family's circumstances." His hand stilled with a stone halfway to the water. "What do you mean?" Josephine told him everything. The land sales, the foreclosure threats, his father's desperate scheme to save the ranch through strategic marriage. She watched his face crumble as the full scope of the deception became clear. "How long have you known?" 3 days. I wanted to be certain before I spoke." Colton hurled the stone with violent force. It skipped 7 times before disappearing beneath the surface. "He lied to me about everything. While I was planning a future with you, he was selling our legacy piece by piece. He was trying to protect you. By manipulating me into a loveless marriage? By letting me believe we had choices when we have none?" The anguish in his voice cut through her like broken glass. She wanted to comfort him, but knew her touch would only deepen his pain. That evening, Colton confronted his father in the ranch office. Their voices carried across the courtyard where Josephine waited in the wagon. The argument lasted an hour before Colton emerged with his face set in grim lines. "It's worse than you described," We have 6 weeks before the bank forecloses. Margaret's father has offered to buy the remaining land and hire me as foreman, but only if I marry his daughter. And if you refuse? 37 families lose everything because I chose selfish happiness over responsibility. They drove back to town in silence, heavy with unspoken understanding. Duty would triumph over love because both possessed hearts too generous to purchase their happiness with others' suffering. The next morning, Josephine began composing the most difficult letter of her life. She wrote to Mr. Whitfield accepting the San Francisco inheritance and requesting immediate travel arrangements. The letter felt like signing her own death warrant. She found Colton at the church, sitting alone in the back pew where they had shared quiet moments during services. His shoulders carried the weight of impossible burdens. "I have decided to accept my aunt's inheritance." He looked up with eyes that held no surprise, only resignation. "When do you leave?" "The morning stage. It departs in 3 days." "I understand. This town has nothing to offer someone with your opportunities." She wanted to tell him about her real plan, but the risk was too great. If her scheme failed, she could not bear to raise false hopes. "Perhaps some love stories are not meant to have happy endings. That does not make them less real or precious." Colton stood and pulled her into his arms despite the sacred setting. They held each other with desperate tenderness, memorizing the feeling of hearts beating in perfect synchronization. "I will love you until my last breath, whether we are together or separated by 1,000 miles. And I will carry your love like armor against whatever loneliness awaits me." Word of Josephine's departure spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. The same tongues that had gossiped about her sudden wealth now dissected the collapse of the town's most interesting romance. Margaret Whitmore appeared at social gatherings with renewed confidence, certain that practical necessity would deliver her prize. Judson Reed relaxed visibly as the obstacle to his son's advantageous marriage removed herself from consideration. But Eleanor Reed Morrison confronted Josephine at her shop on the final evening. "You are making a terrible mistake. I am making the only choice that preserves your family and prevents dozens of others from suffering. Colton will never forgive himself if you sacrifice your happiness for his obligations." Eleanor's eyes blazed with protective fury on behalf of both her brother and the woman she had welcomed as family. "There might be another way. Your inheritance includes more than money." "What do you mean?" Josephine shared her research into Cordelia's business connections and the investment opportunities that could save the Reed Ranch without requiring anyone's romantic sacrifice. Eleanor gripped her hands with fierce hope. "You cannot leave without telling him. He deserves to know that love might triumph after all." The stagecoach would depart at dawn. Josephine had 12 hours to choose between protecting Colton from potential disappointment or risking everything on a plan that might restore both their dreams and the ranch that supported so many families. Dawn broke gray and cold as the stagecoach prepared for departure. Josephine's trunk sat loaded with the driver while she made final arrangements with her landlord. The entire town had gathered to witness her exit, some with genuine regret, but most with satisfied curiosity. Margaret Whitmore stood beside her father near the hotel, her smile triumphant. With her rival eliminated, the path to Colton Reed lay clear and unobstructed. Judson Reed watched from across the street, relief evident in his weathered features. The stage driver called for passengers to board. Josephine climbed the steps with deliberate composure, refusing to let the watching crowd see her heart breaking. She had written Colton a letter explaining her true plan, but Eleanor had not yet delivered it. Hoofbeats thundered down Main Street as Colton Reed rode hard toward the departing stage. His horse scattered chickens and pedestrians while he shouted for the driver to stop. The entire street fell silent as he dismounted and strode toward the coach. "Miss Gaines, please step down." His voice carried across the hushed crowd with commanding authority. Josephine descended slowly, uncertain whether Eleanor had delivered her message or if he meant to bid her farewell publicly. Colton reached into his vest pocket and withdrew his grandmother's turquoise ring. The simple silver band caught the morning light as he dropped to one knee before God and everyone in Copper Ridge. "Josephine Gaines, I would rather lose everything I own than lose you. Will you marry me?" Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. Margaret Whitmore's face went white with shock and fury. Her father stepped forward as if to intervene, but Judson Reed placed a restraining hand on his arm. The inheritance includes connections to investors who specialize in ranch partnerships. We can save your family's land through legitimate business arrangements rather than sacrificed marriages. Relief flooded Colton's features as understanding dawned. Eleanor had delivered the letter after all. Then, you planned this from the beginning? I planned to sacrifice everything for your happiness. The business solution only occurred to me 3 days ago. Josephine accepted the ring with trembling fingers. The turquoise stone felt warm against her skin, as if it carried the blessing of generations of Reed women. Yes, I will marry you. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Even former critics seemed moved by the display of authentic love triumphing over social convention. Dolores Carter dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from genuine emotion or theatrical effect remained unclear. Margaret Whitmore departed on the noon train with her father. Their railroad partnership dreams dissolved. Her parting words to Colton dripped with aristocratic disdain, but his attention remained focused entirely on his bride-to-be. 3 weeks later, Eleanor's farmhouse buzzed with wedding preparations. Josephine had insisted on a simple ceremony rather than the elaborate social spectacle Margaret's wedding would have demanded. She wore her grandmother's ivory silk dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her figure. The guest list included Eleanor's family, a handful of genuine friends, and surprisingly, several townspeople who had come to respect the couple's courage in defying expectations. Dolores Carter arrived bearing an elaborate wedding cake, her contribution to making amends for years of cruel gossip. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony in Eleanor's parlor, while autumn's sunlight streamed through lace curtains. Josephine and Colton exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to choose love over convention and partnership over pride. The reception spilled onto the front porch, where neighbors shared food and stories late into the evening. Children played in the yard while their parents celebrated a love story that had transformed from scandal into inspiration. Mr. Whitfield arrived from San Francisco with contracts finalizing the ranch investment partnership. Cordelia Gaines's business connections had indeed provided salvation without requiring anyone's romantic sacrifice. The Reed Ranch would modernize and expand under the new arrangement, securing employment for current workers and creating additional opportunities. 6 months later, Josephine stood in her new dressmaking school, watching 12 young women master techniques her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. The inheritance had funded the building and equipment while providing scholarships for students who could not afford tuition. Each girl learned more than sewing skills. They absorbed lessons about dignity, independence, and the power of skilled hands to create security in an uncertain world. Josephine saw her grandmother's legacy living on through each careful stitch. Colton found her there most evenings, reviewing lesson plans or helping students with difficult techniques. His initial skepticism about women's education had dissolved as he witnessed the transformation of lives through practical skills training. The ranch prospered under the new partnership. Modern equipment increased productivity, while improved breeding programs enhanced the quality of their cattle. The investment had proven beneficial for all parties involved. Their marriage deepened through shared challenges and mutual respect. Colton consulted Josephine on business decisions while she valued his practical insights about her school operations. They had become true partners in every sense. On their first anniversary, they returned to Willow Creek for a private picnic. The cottonwood trees wore autumn gold as they spread the same quilt where Colton had first declared his love. Do you ever regret choosing love over easy wealth in San Francisco? Josephine considered the question while watching the creek flow toward distant mountains. I chose both love and purpose. The inheritance gave us options, but you gave my life meaning. The town still talks about our wedding. Let them talk. We proved that authentic love creates stronger foundations than convenient arrangements. They sat together in comfortable silence as sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Their love story had become legendary in Copper Ridge, not for its drama, but for its demonstration that courage and authenticity could triumph over prejudice and convention. The seamstress who had once stitched alone by her window now belonged to a family, a community, and a purpose larger than herself.